everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Sam Jacobs from InvestorStream. I'll be hosting today's presentation from Melbana Energy Executive Chairman Andrew Purcell, who will also be joined by the company's Chief Geoscientist, Errol Johnston. Today's presentation will provide an update on the company's drilling preparations for the Alameda 2 appraisal well, with further insights from Mr. Johnston on the objectives of the planned drill program and the geology of the 3 independent oil reserves encountered to date. After the presentation, we'll commence a live Q&A session where attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions directly. If you'd like to join the Q&A, please click on the hand icon in your GoToWebinar control panel, which will place you in the selection queue. Once selected by the moderator, you'll receive a prompt to unmute your microphone. Select unmute, and then you can proceed with your question. Obviously, the aim here is to facilitate direct engagement with company management, but also to do it in a cordial and timely manner. So please keep that in mind once you've been selected. And then following the live Q&A, we'll run through some written questions that were submitted prior to the webinar. A copy of the webinar will also be available on Melbana's website and social media platforms later today. So you can revisit the live version once it's completed. But for now, I'll throw it over to Andrew and Errol to kick things off. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, everyone, or good morning for our part of the world. Depends where you're joining from, I guess. Thanks very much for taking the time out of your day to join us on this webinar. We thought it might be a very useful forum to answer the questions that people have been asking about our program in Cuba now that we're on the cusp of beginning the appraisal well program. And I asked my colleague Errol to join us as well because it's Errol's insights that took us into Cuba. I think nothing speaks better than Errol when explaining, what was the thesis, what we found, what the running room is, and I'm going to keep him to his shortest possible leash so we don't get too heavy into the deep, dark arts of geophysics and geology. But there's some slides that I think you might find informative. So if we can go to the next page on the agenda, please. What I proposed to do when I put this presentation together initially was to give an update on the preparations for the drilling program in Cuba. But given the list of questions that have come through and the details that you all want to know, I think I'll just skip over that and leave it to the live Q&A, and suffice to say at this point that everything's on track. As we've said in our announcements recently, I'm heading over to Cuba Tuesday to spend this part of the month there on the ground, making sure operations are organised and everything is under control and people know their roles and there's no hiccups at the last minute, which there always are. But it's a good team. We're experienced drilling in Cuba. It's the same contractors. I don't envisage any issues in getting this program underway on schedule. So then what we would like to do now is to hand over to Errol to give us a bird's eye appraisal view of why Cuba, what's going on there, what we found and what our running room is. Over to you, Errol. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar today. And what I want to try to do is give you a bit of a geological overview of what we've been doing in Cuba. And I thought I'd start with a bit of a tectonic explanation of what the whole Cuban fold belt is about. I don't know if anyone can see my cursor. Can you see a cursor there, Andrew?
I can, Errol.
Oh, that's very handy. So we have the Central American arc system through here, and this arc system rolls back to the east as it sags into the mantle of the Earth through the Lower Cretaceous, Upper Cretaceous, Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, and where it is today is out here at the Lesser Antilles. So the movement of this arc through the Caribbean has to do with actually moving to the east mostly, but moving to the north as well. And as the arc system impinges upon the lower reaches of the North American craton sitting up through here, through the Bahama Banks platform down here, it starts to roll up the apron of the Bahama Banks rocks, which is all the carbonates you see tipping off the Bahamas platform. And they all get rolled up into the fold belt here on the North Cuban side. So it's the consuming of the downgoing slab. So this American slab is slipping underneath the arc system as it rolls back to the north and east, and that causes the fold belt. So what this sets up in cartoon view here is an upper plate succession of rocks, which is the Caribbean arc. Up here in the top right corner, you see the Caribbean arc system. And it's got a 4-arc slab that starts to impinge upon the outer reaches, the downgoing North American Bahamas plate here on the lower plate succession. So this whole succession out through here of the Bahama Banks sees rocks from the Jurassic all the way through to the recent. A big stack of carbonates in platform setting here. And the apron of that platform tipping off into the deeper water contains all the finer grain carbonate rocks that we actually see that's been clipped off the lower edge of this and rolled up into the fold belt here. And you see the succession of cartoons shows how this impinging plate is pushing on the distal reaches of this downgoing slab and scraping off all the distal carbonates and the progressively more proximal carbonates and building this fold belt. Now what this actually does as the upper plate starts to ground and it can't push anymore, the previous slide showed that we actually split off this whole process through this Cayman trough here. So the Cayman trough cracks open and on it goes. This is the Haiti area through here. It's still a very lively trough, that particular transform fault, and off goes the arc to the east. Well, this abandons the fold belt here on the northern margin. So what we see now is an abandoned fold belt that sits here with the suture between the upper and lower plates here in red, dividing upper plate volcanic rocks only in the south from the downgoing lower plate rocks which are composing the fold belt in the north. And you see that map view through here. This is the suture between the upper plate rocks and the lower plate rocks. And the complexities in the lower plate actually lead us to see that there is in fact a lower sheet in the lower plate and an upper sheet in the lower plate. And it's the destruction of these two plates that forms the prospects that we've been looking at. So as we push into this distal pile of sediment, we actually create a blind propagating tip of the fold belt in a big triangle zone. I hope everyone can see the triangle zone is pushing towards a blind detachment. And in the Canadian Rockies, you see these things in raw seismic where you start to see diverging reflectors on both sides of a propagating tip of deformation right here. And that can be shown in the interpreted section with a big triangle zone and a building duplex of thrust sheets here punching into this blind detachment and peeling back the upper sheet. So upper sheet rocks we sort of viewed as being less prospective, and we want to really get into the lower sheet rocks which are underneath this blind propagating tip of this triangle zone. Now this is where the jumping pound field in Alberta, Canada actually is. It's in this stack of thrust sheets behind the propagating tip. So if you come to a line in Cuba where we see coming across the fallen from the Bahamas here in the far right of the section, we see all the sediments tipping into the basin and then a big destructive pile sitting out to the left. Well, viewed as the jumping pound example would suggest, you can actually see a propagating blind tip coming in here. Now, this particular wedge, if you like, acts like a big chisel. And as it's punching into the fold belt from the right to the left along this detachment, it peels back the upper rocks into these series of structures here, which have occupied the Cubans. They've been drilling these sorts of structures and having very modest success in fairly distal, poor reservoir quality rocks. So what our initial thesis was, we need to get underneath all of this. We need to be drilling structures that have been emplaced from the lower sheet, punching into the blind attachment on the lower side of the triangular wedge. So this forms the imbricated stack of sheets that we then decided to drill an exploration well back in this location on the leading edge of this triangle zone to encounter multiple sheets of potentially lower sheet rocks, which would be better quality reservoir. And this was the play that we were pursuing with Alameda 1, sited somewhere on the leading edge of that triangle zone, attempting to encounter these sorts of rocks in this setting. And of course, this seismic line over Alameda. And we see two wells here. We see the initial old Marty 5 well, the old Russian well that was spotted out here in the fallen zone, and it failed to recognise this big triangle zone sitting here. And once again, I draw your attention to the fact that this is a great big triangle zone pushing towards the detachment in and around here and structuring up rocks. So we've got dips increasing to the left of screen, and we can see that stepping up into this stack of sheets through here would be a good site to put the well. So Alameda sat here and it drilled down through the upper sheet carbonates, on and down in through the end sheet, which is this big section in through here, and then through into the higher pressure I sheet, which was actually intersected over at Marty 5, where they recovered oil from the I sheet through here. And we wanted to see whether the I sheet would come back in underneath this and be stacked and repeated above itself here in the Alameda structure. And this worked out exactly as we actually forecast. We encountered oil in the end sheet through here, which is a repeat of what we saw in the I sheet underneath, been punched over this thrust and up into the top. Now, none of these rocks are actually present here in the Marty 5 well. And our surprise was the upper part of Marty 5 actually was all just clastics here. And we instantly encountered oil-bearing carbonates in this part of the section. And this was a surprise because what we've seen is there's a clipping of the back end of this great big duplex has moved over the top of our stack on the seismic section on this purple fault. And it's now placed rocks that belong to the back end of the end sheet over the top of the whole stack here to be encountered here in the Alameda 1 well. So we were surprised, but pleasantly surprised to encounter oil in an extra sheet of rocks over the top, which we hadn't forecast to be present. So this is a little cartoon that sort of captures some of the thoughts I've been sharing. I hope it's all clear. I know there's a delay in how the slides refresh. Hopefully we're there now, Andrew. Are we there?
All good, Errol. Keep going.
All good. We can see now the impinging ophiolite fore-arc tongue of the subduction zone coming in over the top, pushing on the edge of the outer layer of the Bahama Bank succession, which I've cartooned in here to be Jurassic rocks in blue, early Cretaceous rocks in the green tones, and then the later tertiary rocks in the light blue tones at the Bahamas platform. Now all these rocks out through here occupy a fairly extensive apron, and as we start to push on this, the first thing we do is push in this triangle zone a big wedge which breaks off a piece of this at a fault somewhere here and plonks an outer succession of these rocks up and over the top of the piece in the foreland, just like that. So what happened here is we clipped off the outer piece, we moved the ophiolite edge in, we pushed this up a bit over the top, so we've got a complete repeated section here now. And this is this mid-level detachment we actually want to get underneath. The next phase of this is to break off a piece of the lower succession again and punch it in underneath that slab and fold it. So we've now got a folded slab of what was placed in the first place. And the next thing that happens is this is pushing further on this and it breaks through a fault through here. And this becomes that important purple fault. And you see the purple fault moves succession out over the top like this. So repeating that upper sheet emplacement, if you like, through here. And this whole piece belonged to the back of this in the first place. And now you start to see the end sheet structure growing underneath, and the Amistad series of sheets have been placed on top. Now the Amistad series of sheets get folded up through here and completely destroyed, and lots of these different anticlines form above the purple fault, all of which need to be separately investigated and drilled. So there's potential that it exists to the south in through here, behind where we've drilled Alameda. Alameda drilled through this piece of the upper sheet, encountering oil in what's now called the Amistad part of the upper sheet, on in through the end sheet, and the next piece to clip off is the I sheet underneath. So we're going to chop off this piece, push it blind into the detachment, and refold all these rocks. And that's what happened right there. So that's now built the entire succession of rocks that you've intersected at Alameda. You've drilled through the upper sheet succession, on in through the rocks that subdrop beneath the fault, in through zone 3, if you like, and then on into the end sheet and the I sheet. The next thing that happens is the ophiolites go over the top and then get completely eroded in the Alameda setting. So a quick look at that again, just tapping through them. I'll take you back to how that worked, just to get an idea of how a fold belt is built from a flat succession of sediments, progressively. Clip off one big slab, put it on top, clip off another piece underneath, refold that, move the stuff over the top, clip off another piece under that and add to the fold belt, and eventually build the succession of rocks that we actually see here in one piece of the seismic line. So we've only seen the front end of all of this in the seismic. So we build a model out of this, and this is what the model tends to show. We show the well at Marty 5. It only intersected oil in the lower zone, the I sheet. We cross a couple of pretty important faults, and we get the piece of the I sheet that we see here has been intersected by Alameda 1. But there's much more to the I sheet that exists down to the south. And we haven't drilled into any of this until we sight a well back here and such to the south of Alameda 1. So the crests of these zones is back underneath the duplex to the south. So we're in the leading edge of some of these zones. We've discovered oil in the end sheet between these sealing detachments. And these sealing detachments are the ophiolite muds here that we've reported from time to time. We're in the Vega Alta. The Vega Altas are these green tones, and there's several of them because of how the sheets were all emplaced one upon the other. So between the Vega Altas, we actually get separate reservoir zones, separate regimes of pressures, potentially separate regimes of oil quality, and certainly separate regimes of reservoir quality. So it becomes then important to our program to actually describe and test the reservoir quality and prospectivity of each of these sheets in each of these domains to be able to talk about what's recoverable oil and what's not. So we've got several zones. We've got the zones above the purple fault are all the Amistad units 1 and 2. The zone immediately below the purple fault is Amistad unit 2. Then you cross a Vega Alta and you get into Amistad unit 3. All of those zones are going to be intersected by our new well, Alameda 2, which is going to spud right next to Alameda 1 and drill all those units again. It's going to sneak up dip a little bit to have a look at this unit a bit higher on the structure. You have to wait to Alameda 3 to actually see, well, we want to drill all the way through this and down into the end sheet and I sheet again to collect and test these zones. But what's impingent on this is if we recover oil from these zones down here, we've now proven oil way down dip on a large anticline in this stuff to the south. So just to close, I want to show a seismic line that this is from our bag of tricks here in the technical department. We've got an old dynamite line to the south, which keys off the end of the higher quality line we were showing you a moment ago at Alameda 1. But what you can see is the nose of the Greater Alameda end sheet structure here sneaking into the page, and it's clearly part of a much larger slab of rocks that sit to the south in this Greater Alameda structure, where we would need to come back to the south and drill wells back in this location to investigate that sheet. Obviously, oil in the upper sheet above the Purple Fault here in the Amistad collection of reservoirs has friends that sit back behind other faults above the Purple Fault back under here. Now, that ophiolite slab will exist back here, but it's been punched out into the air and it's been removed from this particular terrain. So we don't expect to have to drill through ophiolites, but there is always a risk of encountering ophiolites the further you come back to the south. Obviously, there's much deeper rocks to be investigated, but all of this needs better quality seismic, and hence we won't know much about that until we actually record a proper coverage 3D over these data. So I hope that concludes my little cameo. I hope that I've tried to give you some real data, a bit of look at the real rocks, a bit of look at the models we're pursuing and the reasons we've drilled Alameda and the reasons we're planning to drill the progressive wells that we're adding now.
Thanks very much, Errol. That was very helpful, and I hope everybody enjoyed that 101, and you can turn your exam papers over now, everybody. Sam, maybe you could stop sharing the presentation for the Q&A section that we can get into.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Okay, everyone. So let's go through to the live Q&A. We've got an attendee, Andrew Fawcett, online with his hand raised. Andrew, we've just taken you off mute. That's a prompt to unmute your microphone. If you're ready to go, Mr. Fawcett, yeah, the floor is yours.
Hi there, Errol. Just wondering, what's the potential for the gross section in Amistad to increase the net across the 1,400 metres of gross in that sense, with the drill coming up?
Well, I can jump in, Errol, if you like. I think the question, it turns largely around the logging. You know, the large gross interval we encountered in the first time we drilled these wells, the logs were unable to be gathered in some of the most productive sections we encountered because of the rugosity and the well bore didn't allow the probes to make good contact. So if we can, you know, have a cleaner well bore this time, and we've designed for that, we should be able to get good logs, and therefore that should lead to a higher conversion of the gross to the net, and therefore bigger resource figures.
I think the key thing there, Andrew, is the drilling of that upper section was all designed in huge hole to try to have the casing options to get us to the N and I sheet targets for Alameda 1. So we were never in a position in that large hole to properly evaluate that upper reservoir in the Amistad. In the surprise carbonate sheet, we run into it after 500 metres. So this new well is designed to actually start off in much smaller hole where the logs will be much happier, and they'll be able to record the resistivities and the other logs through the upper section much better. It's gone quiet.
Yeah, well, Sam will pick up the next question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
my apologies there, gentlemen. It's just Sam, the moderator here. I think we may have just lost Andrew at the end, but thank you for those answers. We'll keep an eye out for anyone else who puts their hand up for the live Q&A. Again, if you want to ask a question to Andrew and Errol directly, just click on the hand icon in your control panel, and then we'll select you to ask that question. For now, we might kick over to some of the written questions that were submitted to Andrew and Errol prior to today's webinar. So some of the questions that came through, there are a group of questions, Andrew, that surrounded the drill rig. Can we just address the drill rig that's currently located at a third-party site? And will that have a delay on drilling operations, do you think? And thus delay the mobilisation back to the Alameda well pad. Can you just provide some context around that?
Sure. No, we don't imagine it'll have a delay. We've been given a projected completion date. The well is spudded. It's an important well for Cuba too. I mean, the electricity grid in Cuba is almost entirely oil-fired, and they have a gas peaking turbine, which is low on gas, which is a material contributor to the stability of the grid. And this well is going to put another gas well into that turbine, so it's an important well for Cuba. It worked in with our scheduling. You know, might have, you know, if everything goes perfectly, it might have cost us a week or two on our spud date, but nothing material. And it's a short, simple well, and they'll be coming straight to us once they've completed it. And the scheduling for that is, as I said, we should be, I'll know more next week when I'm on the ground and I catch up with the contractors, but you know, they're planning to have it finished by the middle of next month, about the 20th. They'll be mobilising to us.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So just tying that into another question, based on those dates that you provided, at the moment you envisage drilling can commence by around the end of Q1?
No, mobilisation will commence by the end of Q1. We'll be commencing drilling in April.
Yep, understood. Thanks. Perhaps turning to the exploration side of the project from these written questions. One question that was submitted was, despite the impressive wide-angle shots of the Alameda pad, how many barrels per day are they going to be able to truck off of A1? And are plans in place for this capacity to be increased prior to pipeline build to aid cash flow?
Yeah, we've done, we're prepared for production, and it's sort of an on-demand requirement. You know, we've got on-site storage capacity, quite a bit of it. We are planning to fabricate more storage capacity to accommodate the eventual deeper appraisal well 2. But Cuba lives on trucking oil around the country, so it's got a very substantial fleet, and we can turn on as much as we need to, and they'll be only too happy to turn up and truck it away. There are also other contractors in Cuba that have oil tankers provided to the mining sector and the refineries, etc. So there's a good installed logistics capability already that we are talking to and we can rely on depending on what we encounter. But the longer term solution, I think, as the question got to, is that, you know, the longer term solution is, you know, to put in place infrastructure, permanent infrastructure for moving around the oil, but we need the results of the appraisal well. But we're modelling up what our expectations are and what the existing right-of-ways are and where the routes are in order to take the oil where in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and just following on from that on the exploration side, based on the A1 learnings to date, how long do you think broadly that it will take to reach total depth on A3 in a best case scenario?
Well, it's not a race to TD, to total depth. The point is to appraise the well. You know, we had a pretty good drilling progress last time. Our projected drilling time was right. If you take out the flat times we had from the surprises, the good surprises often, that we were presented with, the actual drilling time was to plan. This time, what we're doing with a fit-for-purpose well design based on what we know is there, not what we just projected might be there, is to test these reservoirs independently, properly, completely, and work our way down through each of these productive zones. So I think how long we're going to test each section for is, you know, it depends on what we find. So there's a natural tension between wanting to get results and therefore publish reserves and get that bit done with getting as much scientific information out of this appraisal well that can inform the next stage of the field development and give the geoscientists some more information, as you heard, with the running room, the step out opportunities to balance with the production need, and trying to marry everyone's wish list together means I won't be putting a definitive number in place now, just objectives.
Thanks, Andrew. So turning from the written questions back to the live Q&A, we've got attendee Ben Evans has raised their hand to ask a question. Ben, we've just sent you a prompt to unmute your microphone, and I think you're live now. So Ben Evans, if you can hear us, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi gentlemen. Just a quick one on the appraisal program. We don't appear to have an official license for production from the Cuban government. Please correct me if I'm wrong there, but have they imposed a figure of maximum barrels you could possibly extract during the flow test of Alameda 2? And then subsequent to that question, but will it be left on extended flow tests, or will they move to a production license depending on the results?
Thanks, Ben. Let me see if I can get them in order. The PSC, we are governed by a production sharing contract. It contemplates production. We make certain elections once we have certain results, and we can then declare a commercial field. And once we make that declaration, we can produce oil. There are no limits on the amount of oil we can produce. And we have no need for further licenses to produce oil other than what's already governing underneath the contract we have in place. Might have been a third limb to your question that I missed. Hopefully that answers them.
Yeah, I was just about would it be staying on extended flow test if the results prove?
Yeah, it can do. There's, the Cubans are very keen to have oil, and we're keen to get into production as soon as possible to fund our future ambitions in Cuba. And it doesn't necessarily have to be turned off. I mean, we've got another well being drilled off the same path after this one. It's testing the deeper targets, but they're offset sufficiently. So we, apart from safety considerations, but we've thought through those. We think we can leave one on and drill the other one if it's possible.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for that question. We just have another live question up here in the live Q&A. So scrolling down to attendee Frank Cunningham. Just taking you off mute there, Frank, so if you can accept that prompt. Just waiting on Frank Cunningham. Yep. Okay, I think you're live, Frank. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, interesting what you had to say, Errol, in your presentation. I guess to both Errol and Andrew, what rights do Melbana have to step further south and explore those zones of interest?
We have a very large contract area, and I think the southern boundary of our permit area, at the top of my head, Errol, is well beyond the area that you're looking to step out to test the extent of these structures, right?
Yeah, all of those zones on that seismic line I showed you, that old dynamite line to the south, the entire strike length of that dynamite line is within our acreage of the Block 9 license. So if we are to find any form of movable hydrocarbons anywhere in Block 9 at any level, we can happily exploit them. So the drilling of wells in the southern part of the Alameda complex is completely within the current field limits for Block 9.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, so Andrew and Errol, perhaps turning back to a written question, moving from the exploration side to distribution, one of the questions submitted was, Melbana's stated intention is to truck any future oil to Varadero oil processing facility. The company's previously indicated that there's a pre-existent easement or access way from the area of the Alameda prospective production well to Varadero. What do you think is going to be required or needs to occur to warrant pursuit of a pipeline direct to Varadero should access be available?
Well, we either go to Varadero, or we might go south to Cienfuegos, the refinery there. It depends on the quality of the oil, the production volumes. Initially, it's trucking, and as I said earlier, that is a logistical capability that Cuba has in spades, and that'll do us initially. But once we have the results and the qualities, we need fixed infrastructure, and our mind is already turned to that.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, just turning back to the live Q&A. Attendee John Staples has their hand up. John, yeah, we've got you there. I think you're live. John, can you proceed with your question?
Yes, just a short, simple question. Where do you see, projecting ahead, what do you see going on with Melbana, say this time next year or even in 25?
The biggest priority for us following this appraisal well program, and the one I'm already into the weeds on planning, is field development. You know, a discovery of this size, once appraised, the great prize for us is to get as much of this oil produced and sold as quickly as possible, and that's going to mean not doing things, you know, by sequential wells. That's going to mean having a work program that contemplates multiple development wells, some step-out exploration wells, a seismic program. I think Errol would find very helpful in his team to help us firm up some of these theories before we have to stick drill bits into the ground and define the best step-out targets and the best opportunities and other structures. So things get ramped up and get very busy indeed from here. On the assumption of successful appraisal wells, which is my base assumption for planning the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you there, Andrew. So we'll just continue with the live Q&A. Attendee Ben Evans has his hand up again, so we'll just go back to Ben. Ben, you've been unmuted there. If you could accept that prompt when you're ready. Thanks,
yeah,
Ben.
Jen,
I think you're live now. A follow-up question?
Yeah, two-part question. One should be pretty easy. The other one, hopefully, a little bit more in depth. Errol, do you think there'll be a need for a 3D seismic program across the block or certain parts of the block at any point in the near future to be able to help you guys achieve what you want to achieve? That's probably the first part. I'll let you.
Yes, absolutely, as soon as possible.
Okay.
These old dynamite lines have given us as much as we can have. You know, realistically now we need to move into the modern era and we have a decent 3D to guide the drill bit. That's absolutely required.
Okay. And second part of the question, sorry, is to you, Andrew. Can we get a final amount of the costs of Zapato 1 if we've got any money that we need to recoup from the JV partner for that? And what our current financial position is going into the appraisal program. We sort of just missed it, I guess, with the last quarterly and that sort of winding up so late.
Well, we still haven't we finished the initial 2-well appraisal program, exploration program last year. There's still, I think we're all done, but just a little bit of P&A of the first well. We'll remove the wellhead of Elevator 1, and then it's technically all completed, and all the expenditure and payments for the initial drilling program there's a small amount left of the overall well budget, but that's in the revision mirror for us now. And our partners and ourselves have approved this year's appraisal budget, and that's what we're on to. The last quarterly, I think you asked, I think it showed, you know, we got a very healthy amount of cash. It was about $40 million. We reported as of 31 December. So we're in a very good position to go forward and do the work we want to do to appraise these discoveries.
Yeah, so I think in one of the early announcements for this appraisal program, you sort of quoted a low 40s, $40 million figure going into the appraisal. So that's still current.
Yep. And we think we can get that down further in time. But, you know, these wells are still a bit specialised in that they are doing many things, appraising many zones independently. So there's a lot more specialisation and expertise and equipment required to do all this than we would have just from, when we start knocking out, multiple development wells.
Okay, thank you to Ben. Just sound the moderator here. Sorry, Ben, I might have just cut you off at the end there. Just continuing the live Q&A, I think we've got another follow-up question from Frank Cunningham. Frank, if you're there, we've just sent you the prompt again.
I think I hit the wrong button by mistake. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries, Frank. So you're back on live now for Andrew and Errol.
No, I think I hit the raise my hand by mistake. Sorry.
The hand up by accident. No,
Yep.
No problem. Thanks, Frank. My apologies, guys. So just getting back into the written questions after that live Q&A session, Andrew, there's a couple of questions here on distribution. We could have been through queries on the state of the rig and the exploration program. One question on distribution was, for anybody with experience in flow testing, storage, trucking and logistics, it's definitely feasible to transfer 1,000 to 2,000 barrels a day during the testing process via tankers in the road network. But as this figure increases, it can become trickier. Do you see any potential pitfalls for the operation if Melbana needs to scale up significantly in a period of time, i.e. to 5,000 or 10,000 barrels a day if the pipeline isn't ready for some time?
No, I think we've talked to that. Cuba has a great installed logistics distribution capacity. This is what they do. They move oil all around the country all the time by truck.
Yeah, thanks. And there's a quick follow-up to that. Understand this is contingent on the appraisal results, but has there been any movement on a refurbishment of the pipeline? And is it possible to give a figure of barrels per day it was operating before it was mothballed, or would we be looking at a total replacement using the same easements?
Yes to all of the above. We have done some desktop work. My personal experiences with another engineering firm that I chair, as we built plenty of cross-country pipelines here in Australia in that company. It's always easier to. The hardest bit for pipelines is the right-of-way. Getting all the permissions, putting them in the ground, land acquisitions, permits. Once something's there, going in and replacing it, putting something in the same footprint is much easier. So we need to be informed by volumes and the future, and we're thinking out as to what might be required, but we still need to know qualities, because south is an option with the refinery for one set of qualities, north is another option for the tank farms and the deep water ports if we're going to export. Lots of contingencies at the moment. We need to collapse them into a little bit more knowledge.
Thanks, Andrew.
Based on the appraisal.
Thanks. So just continuing with the written questions, perhaps from distribution to sales, there's a couple of questions sort of on the broader sales outlook. One is, while obviously not guaranteed at this time, however, assuming that in due course it's announced that Melbana has a commercially saleable quantity of oil in play, what's the process, and is it likely to be a lengthy one in dealing with the Cuban government and any JV partners in getting the sale of that oil underway to third parties?
No, we've got everything we need, as I said earlier.
Yep, understood. Okay, we've just got a couple more on the live Q&A. I might return back to Andrew Fawcett, who asked the first question. Andrew, you've got your hand raised again. We've just sent you the prompt to unmute.
Thank you. Just wondering, with Errol, is the discovery so far, has it been fully mapped on seismic, or is it partially off seismic? And what is the potential aerial closure size in that sense? Is it over 10 square kilometres or 20 or 30 square kilometres, or much larger than that?
First of all, with the limited grid that we have of higher, well, let's say modest quality seismic, the Sherritt grids from the 2000s, that defines the frontal part of the the Alameda discovery, and is sufficient to say what's in the upper sheet. And the upper sheet covers a certain acreage, which translates into the published reserves that we've released to the market. That is contained. That closure is contained within the current 2D grid. The deeper section goes off grid to both the east and west, and so clearly there is more to know in both of those directions for the I and the N sheet contributions to this discovery, and of course they are the lion's share of the big reserves. So there's no doubt that there is need for more seismic to complete the mapping of this structure. That said, there is sufficient closure defined to satisfy McDaniels, our certifier, that we have a good handle on what's in place here within that, and additive reserves to that, which would be shown by more seismic and more mapping, is actually out there in the blue sky, which has not been realised yet, because what would follow after mapping and seismic would be actually needs for a well to the west and the east to appraise the extent of the oil in both those directions. And it's highly likely that it'll become part of separate anticlinoriums in both of those directions. It's interesting to also realise that both of those cases are actually in Block 9. And we did talk about the very large Grace structure, which is to the east of Alameda as it stands. We've had our certifier have a look at that, and obviously there's more seismic required, but that's prospectively very attractive to us. So the answer is there is more seismic that's needed to complete the mapping of the holistic resource, but we have enough to be able to talk about what's been certified today.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Continuing the live Q&A, we've got attendee Christopher Best also has their hand raised. Christopher, we'll just take you off mute and accept that prompt.
Yeah, how you going, mate?
Yeah, good, thanks, Christopher. Floor is yours.
How you going, Errol and Andrew? You'll have to excuse me if my question's a little bit amateurish, but you guys have pointed to 6 billion barrels in situation with a 5% recovery. Can you just give us an idea if that 6 billion can be expanded, like as far as the resource and the chances of you obviously getting a better recovery rate than 5%?
Well, I can take it. I think I've outlined several large structures that are as large or bigger than Alameda. And let's not forget the unfinished business at Zapato, and further out from Zapato, there's even larger structures again. All of these things have different reservoir regimes. In fact, the ones in front of Zapato, the whole thesis about trying to drill through the leading edge of the ophiolites and encountering the rocks underneath. We were trying to get into a better reservoir province from a depositional standpoint, and that still is unfinished business. If we can encounter, 20% porosity plus carbonates, oh, well, why wouldn't you want to start there? But, you've got to make do with what you have, and so pretty happy with 12% to 15% carbonates, and let's make a go of that. Well, there's big structures behind to the south of this as well. So, obviously, better reservoir enables you to up your recoveries. And this is not something that the Cubans are used to, because they're very used to production from fractured micrites, which are very fine-grained stuff and poor reservoir quality in the offshore. Now, if we find better reservoir quality, then the recovery could easily be somewhere between 5 and 10% happily. And if you can even get it up, if you wanted to introduce some sort of fracking or enhanced CO2 flood recoveries, these sorts of things can increase those. They're certainly successful in the Permian, West Texas, of getting up to around 25% recovery from such rocks. So upping the recoveries is really the big deal and should be possible with the application. Let's remember we're actually onshore here, so all these technologies would be available to us going forward. And as far as getting better reservoir quality, well, that's a facey situation.
Okay, I think that answers the question. Thanks, Errol. If you had anything to add to that, Andrew?
I would just answer your question far more simply. There's a lot of running room, and there's good potential for the recovery rate to be greater than the 5% that our independent certifiers have given us, because that's the Cuban average to date, based on the shallow, heavier oil that they produce.
In different rocks.
Thanks, Christopher. So yeah, just turning again back to our list of written questions submitted prior to the webinar. There's one directly for Errol. Errol, during question time at the PESA luncheon last year, you mentioned CUPET, C-U-P-E-T, might not allow time to flow test all upper sheet zones separately with a preference for accelerating production. Did you have to push for this, and how great an impact might this have to the ultimate upper sheet reserves figures?
Well, our certifier wants to have recoveries and proven production from the zones that we're assessing. And they don't need a lot to be able to say that it's actually going to flow, and potentially they can work with that. So the flow times don't have to be terribly lengthy, but you do have to record flows from each sheet you're calculating reserves in, or you can't move it from the possible category into the proved category. So that's a pretty important step. As far as CUPET, well, they're pretty impatient to get this thing moving, but so they don't want to see us sitting around flow testing for a year. So what, obviously the balance that Andrew was said, you know, when does a flow test stop and the thing is left to produce? It's a bit grey, but we haven't had to push for anything. I mean, CUPET have been very cordial. They come and help us at every opportunity, and I think they'll listen to whatever we think needs to happen to have responsible production move forward from this field. It's an important find for them.
Thanks, Errol. So we've got some more attendees with their hands raised, so we'll round things out with the live Q&A. First of all, turning to Richard Carter. So Richard, we've just taken you off mute, if you accept that prompt.
Yes, okay, I've unmuted myself.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. You're good to go.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple of questions for Errol. Errol, one of the things, as Andrew's mentioned, post the appraisal drilling, you want to get into production fairly quickly. What's the thinking on shooting a standalone close space 2D survey over the prospective areas prior to a 3D to allow you to start to move on production as soon as you can?
Good question. I mean, there's pros and cons of all of that. The biggest con is you have to get a crew into the country to do anything at all. And to get a crew into the country, you have to specify, well, what do you expect them to be able to do? And because we have a great need for the mapping of the details of these reservoirs, because particularly small-scale faults need to be defined, and the numbers of sheets and detachments need to be seen and defined, a 3D is the answer to the technical question because of the dips you're trying to migrate in 3D space. You're trying to actually put all the energy into the ground and get it all back to where it's supposed to be, and that's a 3D migration problem, and that's the biggest single uplift that we think you're going to really see here in the seismic space, because the 2D seismic is poorly oriented. It's not at right angles to the fold belt, so the existing 2D is not as good as it could be. To shoot more 2D is once again going to delineate prospects, but then you've got to drill them. So you're getting out ahead of yourself a little bit here, because you can only drill, there's only a certain amount of equipment in country, and we're going to soak it all up drilling appraisal wells on Alameda. So there's no point defining prospects until you can drill them. And to properly locate these step-out wells in Alameda, we really need that 3D migration. So a 3D grid is very easy to see being more important than more 2D at this stage.
Okay, thanks for that. One other query, I noticed in one of your recent releases to the market that the Armistead Unit 2 had, you've seen fractures in that unit. was wondering if these were fractures seen with the FMI data as per the Alameda, showing that those very good open fractures, or whether this was, proposed to have seen fractures from the caliper log, mudcake buildup, things like that, loss of drilling fluids into the formation.
I believe we've seen evidence for fractures in all of our zones. And I'm not surprised, given that we're on the leading edge of a triangle zone.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. We've got some more attendees with a question. So I'll turn to Bruce Harris now. Attendee Bruce Harris, we've just sent you an unmute prompt. Just wait for Bruce. Yep, Bruce, you're online now. If you can hear us, the floor is yours. We've got Bruce live, but just not getting any audio yet. So I might turn to our next attendee with their hand raised. Just scroll down the list here. And attendee Glenn Winchester, will turn to you. Glenn, if you can accept your prompt. Yeah, Glenn.
Yes. Just
yeah, we can. Yeah, I think we've got you, Glenn. You're a little bit faint, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll try and speak up. Just following from a previous question about availability of rigs and supplies in Cuba. Can you see down the track, because of the delays we've had with getting mud and actually getting the rig backwards and forwards, will there be a need for another rig, or is that out of the question?
No, it's very much a need for more rigs, and there are other rigs available in country. We're having discussions with the owners of those rigs. Once we've got a development program plan for the future, I can foresee us moving to bring more rigs into the country. It'll support contractors mobilising more rigs. We need. I think at their peak. I mean, Sherritt, for example, we probably had, I think, over 7 or 8 rigs going at once at one time in Cuba. That's the sort of thing we need to get to.
Okay, I've just got one more question regarding Beehive. If Beehive should be successful and you get royalties from that, that money won't be. You can't use that money in Cuba. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. We've drawn a line between a pocket for our work with EOG and our interest in that well, and what we're doing in Cuba. EOG's a Texan oil company, so naturally, given the sensitivities between the US and Cuba, we don't want to embroil them unnecessarily in any geopolitical issues. So yeah, they're separate.
So hopefully Almeida will be self-sufficient and provide sufficient funds without any more capital raising.
Indeed, that's what we all hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. Turning to our next attendee, Jason Hornhart. Sorry, Jason, you've got your hand raised. We've just sent you the unmute prompt. Just wait for Jason. Yeah, Jason, you're live now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Hear me okay?
Yeah,
morning, guys.
Andrew,
it seems that Errol is really keen for the 3D seismic surveying. Is that something that's readily available in Cuba, or will that have to be brought into the country? And if so, would we be looking at that program 2023 while we're doing appraisals, or more likely to 3D in 2024?
It definitely needs to be brought into the country, and it won't be this year. Planning work has only just begun as to what we want to do next and where we want to look at, and this will take a while to organise. So it'll be back end of next year at the earliest before Errol's going to get this program going. Yeah, I'm sorry, Errol. Maybe it's sooner, but I don't think so.
Yeah, right. So we'll be looking at close to 2 years before we'd get a full 3D mapping of the area, so we can really quantify what is actually down there.
Look, probably realistically, yeah, but we've got plenty of things to be doing in the meantime. We can put more wells in the ground based on what we've got already.
Okay, no worries, thank you.
I think that's something I was very careful to share with Andrew when we made this discovery. We said that, look, there's plenty we can do with the data we have, with defining the limits of the resource, but the detailed information we'll need going forward to properly locate directional wells is going to be needing the 3D, because you see every 2D line, you're limited to what you can do along that profile. So that controls the direction you're drilling, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Errol. Attendee, we're close to finishing up. I'll just check with attendee Bruce Harris. We had some technical difficulties there before. Bruce, your microphone's live now. If we can hear you, we'll throw it over to you for a question, Bruce Harris. I think we're still struggling to pick Bruce up there. So perhaps, Andrew, you might just round out with a written question. One of the written questions that came through was broadly just on a broad timeline for reserves announcements. How long do you think broadly reserves announcements will take for all three reservoirs following successful campaigns for A2 and A3?
So I think there'll be a cascaded series of announcements from our certifier. Once we give them all the data from the appraisal program, typically they take 2 or 3 months, in my experience, to come back with their report. And that's as much guidance I can give at the moment, I think.
Pretty much as simple as that. Well, that takes us just over the hour mark. I think so that will conclude the webinar proceedings. Thanks to Andrew and Errol for your presentations and also for that Q&A period. I think there were some good questions, and what Andrew and Errol wanted to do here was provide a forum for direct dialogue with investors and shareholders who follow the company. So we certainly hoped that was achieved today. As we said earlier, a recording of the webinar will be available on Melbana's website and social media platforms and the usual channels to revisit. So, Andrew, are there any quick comments that you wanted to add just before we go?
Thanks everyone for your patience and for your interest in our company, and I look forward to keeping you all fully appraised of the appraisals as we get through it this year. So it's a very exciting time for our company.
Yeah, thanks again, Andrew and Errol, and thanks to the attendees for your questions. That'll wrap it up now. So, bye everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye everyone.